Why would an anthropologist and Stanford professor leave academia to join a technology company? And could the reason hold the key to making sense of both big data and the future of computing? I'm Charles Araujo, and this is the TransformIT Show, presented by the Intel IT Center. Not long ago, I flew to Portland to sit down with Genevieve Bell, Vice President and Fellow at Intel. We discussed her journey from university professor to tech savant, the problems with big data, and how to avoid your blind spots. Genevieve, welcome to the TransformIT Show.
I'm really excited to be here.
And I'm so excited to have you. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Just in a couple of our early conversations, I'm already bracing for this. It's going to be fun. So let's start with the obvious question. How did an anthropologist, a Stanford professor no less, end up working at a company like Intel?
This is the story my mother would like me to stop telling on camera. So I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998, and he changed my life. I mean, you're right, I was a professor at Stanford. I was teaching. I loved that. Wasn't looking for a different job, but this man was a venture capitalist in the Valley. He asked me what I did. When I told him, he said you could do more, and it was the most extraordinary moment of my life.
So do more. So how did that really, I mean, that resonated with this idea of doing more?
Well, initially I kind of thought he was a bit of a jerk. It's a terrible thing to say because, you know.
Venture capitalist.
Oh, well, no, I didn't really know that. No, it was more, you know, I managed to get my way into a tenure-track job at Stanford. That was a pretty good thing for an anthropologist. And so to be told to do more seemed really kind of rude. But ultimately, no, it connected to some personal values I have. I'm lucky enough to have been raised by my mother, who was really big on the notion that if you could see a better world, you were kind of morally obligated to go make it happen. And I thought teaching was one way to do that, but Bob and I ended up having this series of conversations about what was going on in the Valley and with new technologies, and ultimately I realized I could do more at Intel too.
So Intel finally was successful in wooing you into this process, and they brought you in, and what was your first order of business?
Oh, so that was a fun experience too, right? Here's this massive company that I really didn't understand, trying to convince me I should come join them, and I just kept going, no, 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 no. And one day I woke up and realized that it was an extraordinary invitation, right, to be in the middle of one of the biggest tech companies in the world that was in the business of building and making the future. And that the kind of opportunity to go there and be an anthropologist kind of inside all of that mix was just amazing. And it had been a long courtship. And when I finally turned up, my new boss said, great, now you're here, we need your help with two things. And I'm like, okay, what are they? And my new boss said, we need your help with women. And I went, which women? Because that seemed like a good question. And she said, oh, all of them. I'm like, all 3.2 billion? Yep, she said. I'm like, okay. So in my notebook, I wrote down women all. So I underlined it a few times. And there's this kind of moment where you think, that's a great project. And then I realized that this new boss had said there were two things. And if the first thing is women all, it is terrifying to contemplate what the second thing would be, right? I'm sure I hope she'd say men, because then it was, you know, discuss humanity. But she said Intel, again, 98. Intel had what she described as an ROW problem. And I said, what's that? She said, rest of world. And I'm like, uh-oh. Where's world such that there is a rest of world? She said, well, that's America. I'm like, okay. So there's America and then everyone else? She said, yeah, we'd like some help with them. I'm like, okay. So I looked at my sort of instructions that were now women and rest of world. And I thought, I should go back to my desk now and just have a bit of a think about what my life is going to become.
Good thing there weren't three things, at least.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine.
So, I mean, I think it's a testament to a company like Intel that has the resources and the outlook to say, to be addressing those kind of challenges. But I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, how do you start with that kind of a mandate?
Oh, well, exactly. I mean, well, first of all, you go back to your desk and do a little dance, because, like, if that's not the best mandate I've ever heard, I don't know what would be, right? It's also daunting and terrifying. You know, what is the research you would do to sort of fulfill that? But I think for Intel back in the late 90s, it was, you're right, this moment of sort of realizing that what had kept them successful up until then might not be what would propel them forward. And part of it really was about how do we start to pay attention to the people using our technology, and can we look at their pain points and their aspirations and their desires and use that to start driving the next generation of technology we're developing. And that was a real breakthrough for Intel, and I think a lot of other tech companies have kind of followed that path too.
And I think it's fascinating because I think it's also a point at which certainly the audience that I'm trying to talk to, which is the up-and-coming IT leader, the digital leaders we're calling it, are reaching a very similar point where the things that we've been doing maybe aren't the things that we should be doing in the future, and so we need to have a different outlook.
And I think there's this critical moment that a lot of companies get to where the sort of the biographies and the instincts of your senior leadership team no longer looks like the market or audience you want to have a relationship with, right? And the bigger that gap gets, the harder it is just to bridge it with quantitative data. You can't just rock up and say, 70% of people do this, because if you're a leader and you're not doing that, it's really hard to kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes. So, you know, when I look at my career and careers of people like me in the Valley and beyond, you know, part of the value we have always brought was to be able to help bridge that gap. Not just with data, but with being able to give people that moment they can put themselves in someone else's shoes, so a little fleeting moment of empathy, right? And I think that makes a huge difference when you're trying to think about how do you build products or services or solve problems when they're not your problems. You have to be able to kind of have some motivation, not just rationally, but emotionally as to why you're doing that.
So this leads us to something that I'm really interested in talking about, and we chatted a little bit previously about this idea of big data. There's all this hype about big data right now, but you have this really kind of interesting perspective about the need to balance the quantitative side with kind of your perspective, or what I think you call the qualitative understanding, right? So explain that a little bit.
Well, I think one of the challenges about big data is it's a really seductive notion, right? It's like if we have more data, I always get said to me, more data equals more truth. And I think, well, no, more data just equals more data. And truthfully, until you know what you're going to do with it, how you're going to analyze it, the data, I mean, it's valuable at one level, but its real value is sort of waiting to be extracted. And the challenge with how you think about extracting and mining data out of those things is, what is the tool you are using to do that? You know, an algorithm, sure, an analytic, a visualization. But all those rely on a theory of what works with what moves with what's connected to what. And every one of those theories has embedded in it assumptions about the way the world works, about what should connect to what, and all of those are ultimately value judgments. And the challenge sometimes is, how do we make sense of and unpack those value judgments? And those are not just about quantitative, i.e. sort of numbers-based, but also qualitative. They're about narrative and feeling and emotion and intuitions. And the challenge is how you balance those two things.
So how do you? How do you bring these together?
I mean, I think it means that we see it increasingly, right, when you look at companies that are recruiting data scientists. 3 and 5 years ago, that was an emerging category. They were looking out for computer scientists for the most part, and a little bit of, you know, math into physics. Increasingly, what we also see is people looking for economists, behavioral psychologists, people at behavioral linguistics, even just a little bit around the edges of philosophy, anthropology, and the social sciences, right? Because it's very clear that part of what you're doing in analyzing big data is looking for patterns, and not all patterns are immediately visible, and not all patterns mean the same thing. So there's this level of increasing levels of interpretation, right? First you have the data, and frankly, as you and I both know, not all data is good data, and the data can be scrutinized by how it was collected, under what circumstances, structured or unstructured, and there's lots of wiggle room in all of that, right? And then there's what's your analytic tool, what are your algorithms, and each one of those adds a level of interpretation, and thus a level of kind of, I don't know, not bias, that's the wrong word, but a level of kind of interpolation, where I think there's just room there to start to imagine what are those things. And for me, I think you get much more out of big data when you have lots of different lenses applied to it and you're doing it critically. So for me, part of the answer is making sure that the skill sets you're bringing in to do that work aren't necessarily the same skill sets that collected the data.
And I think it's part of the risk, right? So one of the guests I had on just a couple episodes back was talking about the story of Netflix and how they are using big data in some amazing ways to help craft their actual product strategy, how they're developing new products. But when we were talking, you had the counterpoint to this story of sorts, right?
Oh, which is, you know, that Netflix now has Grant McCracken on the payroll, who is a demographer, an anthropologist, a social scientist, a futurist, who has a very, you know, human-centric worldview. Because sometimes it's about, sure, you can see lots of patterns. What are the relevant ones, and what is the action you take on the basis of it? Those are all very different pieces of the equation, right? And being able to kind of critically say, okay, well, lots of people watched it. Did they watch anything else by that person? Lots of people started watching it. Did they finish watching it? And if not, why not? And, you know, what are the things that you can start to decide on the basis of that, right? And I think it's no surprise to me that as people move further down this data analytics and data-driven world, they're looking for an increasing range of skill sets to help them make sense of it.
Because I think that's actually the big risk, that we as IT people, we love to think about this. Oh, this is great. Now we get rid of that squishy stuff. It's all about data and numbers, and we can crunch it and compute it. But I think when we were chatting before, you mentioned something that our big risk here, as you look out at the world of big data, is our blind spots.
Oh, absolutely. And the sort of, I think the seduction of big data is always the grandness of the data set. I have a lot of data. The challenge is mostly what data tells you is the what of things. It doesn't tell you the why. And in my mind, the why is also hugely important. So when you listen to people like Google talk, they'll say, well, actually, we worked out the what, but we had no idea about the why. So we hired social scientists, we hired linguists, we hired people who cared about semantics and semiotics. You know, people who could actually understand the patterns, because the why piece is as important as the what. And I think it's really easy to get kind of obsessed with the 95% does X, but unless you know why they're doing it, not only do you run the risk of a blind spot, you run the risk of seeing a pattern for possible innovation, and you run the risk of missing the next thing that's coming, right? Because you're so obsessed with what the people are doing, not the fact that they may be using that because there's no good alternative, and as soon as someone comes up with a good alternative, you're done.
What a fresh look at the challenges with big data, and how if we're not careful, an over-reliance on data can cause blind spots. Genevieve advised us to stay focused on the human side of the equation in order to understand the whys. This is going to be critical as we move into this new landscape. And that's just the beginning. In the next episode, Genevieve is going to share with us an in-depth view on the challenges we'll face as our world becomes even more connected. She'll also talk about why we're beginning the shift to human-computer relationships and what this all means to you as an IT leader. You're not going to want to miss the rest of Genevieve's interview. Until then, I'm Charles Araujo, and together we can change the world of IT.